Stephen, so good to chat to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
I've just watched your documentary, and it is Merchant Ivory. It's a completely fascinating watch. I have to be honest, I haven't seen all of the Merchant Ivory productions, all of their movies, but it makes me want to go and watch all of them now.
I know that's a very common response I get from people that watch the film, and and obviously, I mean, most likely, not everyone knows the kind of entire large Merchant Ivory library. I mean, James Ivory and Ismail Merchant made 43 feature films over the course of over 45 years, and another thing I hear is that folks want to go back and see some of the Merchant Ivory films that they don't know, like Shakespeare Walla or Quartet or some of the films that I feature. Merchant Ivory is most well known for their British, the E.M. Forster adaptations, A Room with a View, Howard's End.
Yeah.
And then,
those are the ones that I'm familiar with. That I most recently saw Morris actually on the big screen when it was at the BFI a few years ago. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, and it was so great to dip back into that again because I remember seeing it when I was around about 17, I think, and it is a hugely influential film and very, very powerful. I think it's an important piece of work. But I guess my first question to you would be, what made you get the idea to start this documentary? The idea.
Yeah, so Merchant Ivory, like you just mentioned, so Morris was a very important film for me. I saw that film, I was about your age as well, 17, 18. And it just kind of changed my life. And so I had seen A Room with a View before that, being a gay kid living in upstate New York, it's kind of a funny story. I worked at a kind of high-end clothing store, and the manager of the store, I think, kind of intuited that I was gay. And he was like, oh, you've got to see this film. And so I saw Morris on a small screen via a VHS, cassette tape, because back in the late 80s, that's what we watched. And so that's really when Merchant Ivory became kind of I became aware of them, and they became kind of significant. And I kind of followed them. And then I made a short animated film. I had met James Ivory through my good friend Peter Cameron, who was the novelist of The City of Your Final Destination, which is the novel that Merchant Ivory's final film was based on. And so I met James Ivory, and I decided to make a short animated film called Rich Atmosphere, the Music in Merchant Ivory Films. Jim provided the narration for that film, and my animation director was this guy, Jack Cunningham, who's based in London, phenomenally talented animator, incredible. And so he helped me put that film together. James Ivory was so impressed with it, and I just felt an opening there. I wanted to make the definitive look of Merchant Ivory and their long arc, filmmaking arc. And so I just pitched Jim. I said, you should let me take the reins on this and do it. And so he, in classic Jim fashion, he's like, sure. And then he just, he kind of backed me up as I was going along. It was definitely, I had to drive it, and it took me 3.5 years to make the film.
Wow.
But, it was nice to have James Ivory there kind of on the side. And then, of course, I interviewed him 5 or 6 times. So it's like I kept going back to him, and he kept seeing, the film as it was kind of marching along and moving forward. So it was great.
Wow, that's a long time, and it's such a celebration. I think you've done such a great job with it. But it often amazes me with documentaries, particularly good ones like your one, how much detail there is in there. And I would imagine it's quite challenging to do a documentary, particularly with something so treasured. I mean, these are films that everybody loved and still love to this day. So was it a challenge in that respect that you had so much to focus on?
Yes, such a challenge. And again, I mean, it has to be mentioned. Do you know how much footage I have that didn't make it into the film? It's, and again, that's so classic, I mean, that's just, typical, of a documentary film. I mean, I shot 58 interviews and, maybe even more. And, some of those interviews didn't even make it in. And that's always sad. But yes, for sure. It took my editor and me a long time to figure out the right structure. So the edit on this film was really kind of gnarly and challenging. But as soon as I figured out that we should be connecting each kind of major Merchant Ivory player to a film, because we used A Room with a View, Morris, Howard's End, and Remains of the Day as really the anchor films for my film. And although we do touch upon a lot of the Merchant Ivory library, those 4 films were really kind of the core or the anchor. And then, and then at one point, I think it was James Ivory who said to me during an interview, he said, well, Howard's End was Ruth's film, Ruth Habala, their longtime writer. And the little bell went off in my brain like, oh, okay, Howard's End was Ruth's film. A Room with a View was more Ismail's film. Morris was definitely Jim's film because that was one that he was really kind of determined to get out into the world. And then Richard Robbins, their longtime composer, The Remains of the Day, it really felt that was his strongest score. And so, I linked that film to him. But yeah, without a doubt, it was difficult, choosing. It made sense what to choose and what to put in the film. But for example, like Emma Thompson, who's just unbelievable. Her interview is just the best and so incredible. And, but I probably, what do we have? Maybe 2 minutes of Emma Thompson in my film. And I mean, I've got 27 minutes of Emma Thompson. So it's like, what I want to do is I want to kind of package all the kind of edited down interviews, several of them, and include them, on the DVD release that'll come out later.
And you mentioned Emma Thompson. I mean, there's some fantastic people in this film. You've got Helena Bonham Carter, you've got Hugh Grant, and James Wilby. I mean, all these people that people are familiar with, the association thing and the family thing. I mean, family is a word that was mentioned quite a lot in this documentary because a lot of the people involved were part of a family or felt like they were. And I think even if you haven't seen many of the films, you know of them and you know the trademarks. But I suppose a lot of the films were misunderstood. There was a section of film where I think it was it Alan Parker that said it was like Laura Ashley filmmaking, so it had that style. But I think when you know the story or when you listen to the story and you listen to the dialogue, like it's mentioned in the film.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, like kind of snobbery that was out there at the time. I mean, I think Alan Parker felt they were kind of hollow films, you're right? They were just very pretty and very like production designed and costume designed without a lot of weight to them. But I think it's Rupert Graves who says in the doc, he's like, well, you're just, anybody who says that they're just looking at the pictures. They're not looking at like what's under the surface. Of course, there's some of these films were based on great novels, right? So so if you're kind of dinging Merchant Ivory, then you're also not giving you're kind of like criticizing in a way like Henry James or Ian Forster or but again, I mean, people are going to have their thoughts on it. I think the really cool thing about Merchant Ivory films is that they do stand the test of time. I mean, I think if you watch Morris now, I think it's still resonant. I think it, I think it still, is impactful. And there's not a lot of films like that. And I also think Sam West says in my film, like Howard's End, he was in Howard's End. And I think his line for my film is not all films look as good 25, 28 years later. And so I do think there was quality there and quality that was achieved by this core group of collaborators working together film after film. And so the word family does get kind of bandied about a bit, but it really was a family. I mean, Jenny Bevan, 3-time Academy Award winning costume designer Jenny Bevan, she kept coming back. She was there from Hullabaloo, a film that was shot in India, and she was all the way through to, Jefferson in Paris. So again, I think one of the things that people can learn, from seeing the film is just there's some nuggets. I believe there's some great nuggets there and like learning moments in my film that future filmmakers could really get something, out of. It's a very inspiring story. This independent production entity, Merchant Ivory, who literally was independent and chose only the projects that they wanted to make year after year after year. And it was also very inspiring to hear the stories about, Ismail Merchant kind of having to kind of bring together the budget for every single film. They didn't have a blank check in any way for any project, maybe until they went, maybe kind of post Remains Day. But really the first 40 years or 35 years of their filmmaking trajectory was independent project after independent project where James Ivory had director's cut all the time, where it was them putting it, together without any studio interference or anything like that.
I mean, it's a compelling story. And on a personal level as well, there's a section of the interview with James Ivory where he's talking about a stranger coming up to him in the street and holding his hand and saying, you don't realise how important Morris was as a film to me growing up. And there is that element as well, that I think this production company did understand humanity. And I think that comes across in the films as well, because a lot of the subjects were taboo, even back in the 80s, which when you think now, all this time ago, it seemed like, we'd come so far even back then, but even back then it wasn't really discussed.
Yeah, I mean, they were really ahead of their time in terms of what they were putting on screen. I agree with you 100%. And what's interesting is, James Ivory, when you meet him, he's a very reserved, very, kind of not in your face with his, so it's surprising in a way when you meet the man that he was so kind of laser focused on making sure that these films that were definitely edgy and definitely kind of taking on, issues that might be considered taboo or considered, out of the mainstream, he brought those films out again with his, team, collaborators. But for sure, I do feel Merchant Ivory should get credit for being ahead of the curve in terms of putting out edgier, kind of more thought-provoking, conversation-provoking theater, or kind of theater-going experiences, films for audiences to really, engage with. And I don't think they got the credit for that at the time. I think that's something that, watching my film, you might come away with that. But and maybe now, as Cohen Media Group is my distributor on the film, and they've re-released restored versions of several of the films that they own, and and I think those films have been reviewed in 2017, 2018, 2019, whatever, and those reviews kind of go back and give Merchant Ivory some of the credit for pushing those boundaries early.
And I think you were brave to approach some difficult subjects as well, and difficult conversations. Obviously descriptions of Ismail, they weren't always flattering. He was sometimes called a charming con man, and you approach that subject with James, and obviously Ismail's not here with us now, so that could be quite difficult for him, but he was very honest, I thought.
Well, he was, and I mean, there's the line in the film where Jim says, spot on, well, he was a con man. You have to be a con man in order to be a film producer, and especially a film producer doing it the way that they, were doing it. Like I said, raising, the budgets every single time, and literally Ismail flying across the globe, trying to bring, this kind of, monetary, this revenue together. But it's those difficult conversations. I will say one thing. So James Ivory's memoir, which is called Solid Ivory, which came out about 8 months before my last interview with Jim that I did in upstate New York. And that book coming out was huge for me, because Jim put a lot of the secrets or behind the scenes information about his relationship with Ismail, in this kind of interesting triangular relationship between Ismail, Jim, and Dick Robbins, the composer. And so because that was in print, I was able to say to Jim, look, you've gone on record and I need this for my film. And so that final interview with Jim, I really went there and I really got some really key pieces that I believe were needed to tell the kind of expanded story. And so so I was able to push him. Jim's just, James Ivory understands collaboration. He understands that, I'm making a film, and I have in my mind what I'm after and what I'm trying to get, and he played with that, and he worked with me, and I guess there is this great question where he's standing outside of the Indian consulate in New York City, and talking about how he met Ismail Merchant for the first time. And, you know, and I just said, you know, I asked the question, well, what was it like being gay in New York City in 1961? That's something that James Ivory doesn't really want to talk about. But again, he wasn't afraid to kind of give me some back and forth with that. And I mean, those moments in making a documentary film and talking to this many people and having the opportunity to ask them about their experience, I love that, because, you know, sometimes you have an idea of what you want, and then you ask a question, and then you go into a completely like roundabout way, and you come up with something phenomenal and something that you even, you know, you weren't anticipating. And there were many, many, many moments like that in this film and making the film.
What would you say is your personal favorite film that they've made? It's probably, it's like choosing your favorite baby, isn't it?
I know, you know, and James Ivory gets this all the time, you know, because we've done, you know, a number of interviews together now. And, you know, but for me, you know, it's got to be Remains of the Day, because Remains of the Day for me is just perfection. I mean, it's just, you know, just this incredibly made at the height of their powers, right? I mean, they had just at that point, and that particular story fit so well into the lives, you know, kind of like into the lives of all the people that were involved with that. Jim, Ismail, Ruth, Richard, Robbins, all four of them. But then, as Emma Thompson says in my film too, like, that film and that story met Tony Hopkins like right in his center. Like, there was something about that story that was just important to, you know, Tony Hopkins, you know, life. And so, you know, that's got to be my favorite. But again, I have just incredible appreciation for the entire library. And again, I have to mention, like, films that people don't know so well. So, like, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge was a film that Merchant Ivory made for Miramax back, I think, they shot that in 1990. It came out in 1991. It stars Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. You know, Joanne Woodward was nominated for, you know, Academy Award for that film. It's an exquisite film based on a wonderful novel called Mr. Bridge, and then the other novel is called Mrs. Bridge. And, you know, that one, and then Slaves in New York is like this crazy time capsule of, you know, New York City in the late 80s. The, you know, New York City that it's gone. It doesn't exist, right? You know, the kind of post Andy Warhol New York City, you know, punky and grungy, and like, you know, and you know, and if you watch Slaves in New York, you really like, yes, it's kind of a flawed film in some ways, and but it's like, it's an incredible, like, they captured New York City in that moment where you would be driving in a taxi, you know, in downtown Manhattan, and there would be like a dead body on the sidewalk. I mean, these things happened as they were making the film. And so, you know, so again, I mean, I love Remains of the Day, but of course there are incredible things that you can get from watching the entire Merchant Ivory library.
I think it was Emma that said that was her personal favorite, wasn't it? That movie.
Yes, and she said, yeah, the incredible thing that Emma said, and actually Hugh Grant says this as well, it's like Emma Thompson says, I believe it's my favorite film out of every film I've ever made. Anything that I've done since then and things that I see now, she said it's her favorite film. And Hugh Grant said, you know, Remains of the Day was probably the best film that he's ever been in. And just, you know, this like incredible, you know, kind of, even like when we talk about what you can pull away from a film or take away from a film, he was just like, it's a masterclass in acting. Watching Anthony Hopkins play, you know, the role of, you know, Stevens the butler, you know, Hugh Grant said, you know, it's a masterclass. And so I think everyone at that point was just firing on all cylinders, and them coming together really like 8 months after they had, you know, finished Howard's End, and just going immediately to that film. Emma, Tony, you know, bringing back Hugh, who Merchant Ivory hadn't worked with in, you know, since Morris. It was just, again, this wonderful team of collaborators that came together for often more than one film.
And I guess my final question to you, I could ask you so many more questions. I don't want to chew up your time. I know you're a busy man at the moment.
No.
What was the most important thing about this documentary that you really wanted to express, do you think? Could you pinpoint one thing?
Yeah, what I really wanted to express, I mean, I just felt that Merchant Ivory hadn't kind of received their due in a way. Like, I just felt so compelled and so passionate to like offer up my version of the arc of that Merchant Ivory story. And there had been many kind of like little featurettes, let's say, right? So you get, you watch a film, and then, in the bonus features on a DVD or something, you'll see a little like 15-minute featurette of the making of Remains of the Day, or, here's, whatever. And so there were these interesting kind of like pieces of the Merchant Ivory history, kind of like, strewn about. But I just felt like somebody needed to capture and tell the story of these four main collaborators that worked together for so long. And so that's really what I was after. I was after kind of preserving cinema history here. That's kind of a lofty goal, but it really was. It hadn't been done before. And one of the most amazing things that James Ivory said to me after he saw the very close to final cut of this film is he said to me, he's like, "You've done what no one has done before." He said, "You've captured us." And it's true. I mean, it's true, because if you look, there'd been some books about Merchant Ivory, but they were about the films. They weren't about the people making the films, the artists making the films. And so when Jim said that, that's probably one of my favorite things he's ever said to me.
And then, that must be amazing.
It was. And then secondarily, we did an interview. The person asked Jim, it was an interesting and kind of an odd question, but they said, would you call Merchant Ivory, the documentary film, a Merchant Ivory film? And Jim, this was just so wonderful. He was like, "No, it's not a Merchant Ivory film. It's a Stephen Soucy film." And so again, that's like another kind of like, wonderful kind of exactly what I was going for, the kind of reaction that I wanted from James Ivory. But really it's more about bringing these voices together, and, obviously putting a film together. But like, there were just, Merchant Ivory gave so many young actors their first role, Gwyneth Paltrow, we mentioned, Hugh Grant, James Wilby, Rupert Graves, and just hearing their voices and hearing what they had to say about the experience of working with Merchant Ivory. And we can't forget too, it didn't stop in the 80s or 90s. I mean, it really went on. Like Uma Thurman went on to do, the Golden Bowl. People wanted to be in Merchant Ivory films. Julianne Moore was in Surviving Picasso. I mean, if you look at, Laura Linney was in, City of Your Final Destination. Yeah. Just the incredible scope of talent that they worked with. And a film that didn't make it into my film was Le Divorce. And that was Naomi Watts, right? I mean, there's just like, again, you look at the people they worked with. It's really unbelievable that so many high-profile actors were clamoring to do a Merchant Ivory film back in the day. And I think that's just a cool thing that people don't remember or didn't even know about.
Absolutely. Listen, Stephen, it's been fantastic chatting to you. I've taken away so much from this documentary. It makes me, like I said at the beginning, it makes me want to go and watch the films that I haven't seen. So I think you've done a great job, and I think job done in that respect, even if it's just to promote the films. But you've done much more than that. So congratulations.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time to do this and letting me talk about Merchant Ivory, which I love. So
you're very welcome. So it's screening at BFI Flare on London's South Bank, and you're going to be here for that, right, in London?
Yes, I am. So we have a screening on March 16th at 3 p.m. It actually sold out the first day the tickets went on sale, so that bodes well, I think. And then we have a second screening on March 18th. But yeah, I mean, I just want to say it's such a gift. I mean, it's such a gift to be at BFI and to be at Flare and to and to have the opportunity to bring a lot of the Merchant Ivory family that I interviewed in my film to the screening. A lot of people are going to be there, and they haven't seen the film yet. So of course, I'm anxious to get their reaction and their response and feedback. So
it's very exciting. Have fun at Flare, Stephen. I wish you all the best with the movie, and congratulations. See you soon.
Thank you so much.